Thank you.
All right, welcome everyone. Happy April already midway through April almost. So for the mission moment tonight, I want to talk a bit about trips and trips kind of being back in the mix, which has been great. We've been off for quite a while. The idea of getting outside of school, being in school, and then getting outside of school to experience some new things and be exposed to new things has been put on pause to some degree. So I want to talk about trips, and I want to specifically talk about college trips. I think this was also highlighted during the SLC call last week. So here you go again, Jeanette. But this past month, a host of kids in our high school took part in the trip to Philadelphia to visit Villanova and Lehigh. So you see a couple of photos here of kids being back on campus, being exposed to perhaps one of their options coming out of Unity High, and just exciting times. So I think we're just kind of like just happy to be back in the mix and gradually taking steps to experience school as we knew it in 2019. So in addition to the trip, this trip, there are a whole host of trips going on. At the middle schools, we kind of close out exams and move into roundtables mode. There's a whole series of trips being planned by our department chairs. Same at the high school. There was a trip today, in fact. And so it feels good to, again, just have kids be experiencing this and getting out and seeing the world. So I think that's important. With regard to college-related stuff, I want to bring your attention quickly to the scoop from this past week. You guys are all getting that weekly, right? On Fridays or Saturdays, it shows up in your inbox. Cool. So if you've got time, you can peruse this thing. It was a busy week last week, and has been busy. I'll say a bit more about that momentarily. But as I scroll down to Mr. Gonzalez's blurb on colleges, I think there's just a couple of things just to highlight here. So as of now, as of this past week, we had about 80 something, low 80s percent wise of kids who have now applied to one college and now are hearing back. A majority have. We also have a small number of students who applied and are connecting with some career programs, both in state and out of state. I may have mentioned this in a prior meeting, but we've got at least one carpenter in the making and perhaps a welder in the making. So some good craft work here. You'll see the list of colleges listed in the first bullet under number 8. And so a host of SUNYs and CUNYs that have done well for us in the past. And so we continue to establish relationships with those schools. In addition, there's some privates kind of built in there here and there, and then some community colleges. So a good mix of colleges that our class of 2022 will be attending in the fall. And then if you look down the page, you'll see other things kind of going on with regard to how we prepare kids and support kids for this process. We've got some seniors visiting SUNY Fredonia. We've got at least 6 or 7 kids there now. And so we've got a nice cohort of kids and a community within that institution. Eric and Nasib are taking part in some writing workshops. I think, Sal, you've had some experience with that in the past in supporting kids with their college essays. And obviously, college financial aid is a big deal and complex. And so all the support we can provide there is important. So a number of things going on, from college trips to then trips in general, to then doubling back to the supports we provided to kids with regard to college. And so that I think is just a part of like who we are as a school or our mission. If we're here and in this work to empower kids to lead fulfilling lives, it certainly doesn't end at the graduation stage. And so supporting kids beyond that's important. So thinking about what we aspire for kids to do as of 6th grade moving forward is at the forefront of our minds until that day in which they graduate and then move into post-secondary endeavors. So that's the mission moment for tonight, to give you a glimpse of kind of some of the things we've been focusing on as a school over the past several weeks, over the past several months, and things we're continuing to build up and improve over time. I think with that, what I'm going to do is quickly move right into the head of school report for today. And there isn't, I'm going to spend more time on the dashboard today. As I mentioned to Jim, I think today's going to be more brief, relatively more brief than some of our prior meetings where we've gone right to the bell, so to speak. So give me one moment as I open up one more document, and that would be the school leader report for this meeting. Okay. And I sent out the April version of the report this afternoon after sending accidentally the March report to you this morning. So you have that now in your inbox. If you want to open it, you can. And so I think a couple of things I just said. First, just from the opening, it's been an eventful stretch. The month of March, from February to April, there's typically about 7 weeks of school in which it's just 7 days, or 5 days, 5 days, 5 days, 5 days, 5 days, 5 days, so on and so forth. So it's a long stretch. It's usually middle school exam time, so there's a lot of kind of units of study of test prep going on during that time. We had mocks at the high school this past month, so an awful lot of kind of like testing, and then in addition to that, there's things going on around hiring for the coming year, planning for the coming year, staffing for the coming year, a lottery that went on, academic award ceremonies as we close out trimesters and semesters, and so just a whole host of things going on. So busy, so our heads have been down and just forging ahead with stuff. There is a break coming up next week, so well deserved for team and for students and families, but it's been an eventful and productive stretch, I would say that. In addition, or maybe in greater detail, I'm only going to mention maybe one more highlight worth noting. Y'all can kind of read this as you go too, but just going to the recent school-related headlines from the past month. I would say, coming out of our last meeting, just know that we have transitioned now to a mask optional policy at both sites. That's gone smoothly at both sites. There haven't been any sort of evident upticks in any cases. It's been interesting to sort of see the way in which students have treated that. We've taught into it and informed kids about the ins and outs of mask wearing in school, and gave them factors at play in making informed decisions for themselves. And I would say, it might be 50-50 in terms of kids wearing masks in school each and every day. And I'd say the same among staff, and maybe even some differences across site and age groups. So interesting, just as a visual observational study. So that's one. And I would say the other bit is just with regard to academics. I mentioned it's been busy. We did have ELA exams this past month at the middle school. Coming out of our last meeting, we had talked about some of the challenges at play with regard to testing. And one of those was stamina. I think observationally, in seeing 2 days of testing and doing some tours of classrooms during those days, like kids, I think some of the practice that we had kids take part in and had adults take part in over the past month paid off. And like some of that stamina was able to increase over time. And so I think some of the things we saw with the mock were not as evident as we had prepared fairly well for the actual exam. And so I think kids felt confident, felt encouraged and inspired, and were able to perhaps give it their all more so than perhaps what they showed in January. So some good signs there. I expect the same in math at the end of this month. So I think those are the only two things I'll mention here from the school leader report this month. We're going to dive into most all of the other items throughout the meeting today, even with the dashboard coming up. But I think before moving to the dashboard, are there any specific questions people have about what's in the leader report and or what's been going on over the past month more generally before diving more deeply into things? All right, I'm going to move us forward. Give me one moment to change screens one more time as I move into the dashboard. Let's make that a little bigger. There you go, that's better. If you want to open that up, you can too. It's also in the folder that I sent out this morning. And here we go. So just where are things with regard to some of the indicators that we look at each month as a school? I think I'll just begin with enrollment. You go to the top of the page here. And just very quickly there, fairly steady. I think we're up 1 in the month from what I reported out last month. We're at 95% utilization versus our target enrollment as of now. And so over the course of the year, we've been at about 518, 519 versus our budget of 532. So under our budget, under our target, 95% utilization. We've been that way over the course of the year, and we continue. I'm going to talk about recruitment in just a moment and where things seem to be going for the coming year. Beyond that, I'll move us down to table 3. Looking at attrition, I'll provide an update next month on that. There hasn't been anything dramatically changing here, so I expect us to be in target here with regard to having no more than 10% of our kids attriting over the course of the year. So I'll have an update there next month. We'll talk about finance momentarily. Other things here, let's move to table 5A, which is just attendance. And I think attendance this month versus the last month, we've been fairly steady at between 85 and 89% across sites, 85 at the high school, 89, low 90s at the middle school. And so those numbers, particularly at the high school, are a bit down on what we've seen in prior years. I'll just admit it's been a challenge to sort of like figure out exactly how to increase that number, even in times right now where things feel relatively healthy and safe. And so I think maybe the past year and a half has just had kind of an impact on like school, self, presence, home. And so we've got about 5% percentage points of our kids who just on a given day aren't there that we typically had there. So we're going to continue to think about ways in which we encourage that. I think some of this might come from just a refresher in the coming year and just start fresh, but that's just been the experience thus far. I don't know if folks have any observations or any sort of insights on that. Madonna, for you, that was one question I had. It's just whether you're seeing or know of any differences in attendance at high schools versus other sites versus other years.
Yeah, the attendance is definitely lower now that students are what is it that you can still accept student work even if they're not there, right?
There's a little bit more of that. I think that's been a part of the experience too, in that there's a little bit more of like, show me what you've done, show me what you've learned, and perhaps a little less sort of strictness with regard to like the when that happens or how it happens. And so that's real too. That could be a result of or that could be reason for some of this. Are there
Josh, are the ones who are not attending, do you see, is there a correlation between the performance and attendance that you can see?
I believe so. Melissa, do you want to speak to that more intimately?
Yes, we don't have a policy that says students can turn in work in absentia alone. If a student is absent, we post the work for kids. And we do provide extenuating circumstance plans for students who do indeed have extenuating circumstances. But our lessons are in-person lessons. Our work is grounded in those lessons. So the majority of children who are failing at the high school to gain credit are also not regularly in class.
Okay, so the causation might run the other way. You're not in class, so you're not getting credit, as opposed to you're not in class, so you're not learning. Is it true? Like if you were to say, just as a heuristical kind of thing, my bottom performers, I kind of know who they are, and those end up also being the people, regardless of test scores and whatnot, just they're the people who are not showing up. Or I'm trying to get my head around, like, could this be because they're still afraid of COVID, or are these just people who didn't have the desire to learn in the first place, or what might be going on there?
I think it's a confluence of situations. There are kids who had previously been attending regularly that aren't attending either because it's fear of COVID or this has been a very hard time. There are a number of children in our school. We don't really know what the reason is, because we had some time where we were not establishing those stories. So, and then there's a number of students who are continuing to struggle, who were the students who struggled when we were in person to attend regularly. So I think they're all compounding. There are some students who are, say, I'm thinking of a student who did have an extenuating circumstance plan, who was staying home to care for his siblings when his mother got COVID and his siblings were too young to go to school. Or one of them got COVID. She got COVID, then they got COVID. So they were out for an extended amount of time, and then he got COVID on top of that in return. So that is a recent COVID circumstance of a child who would otherwise be home, or rather be in school. Then we also have students who struggle to attend, and like reacclimating has been challenging.
Do you have a sense of whether this is consistent with other schools, like the attendance numbers are down, or do you measure it differently such that it's not really comparable? Or,
You know, we've got daily data in comparison to DOE, but I don't know if they break that down. I have it only for all schools, so I don't have it for high school versus elementary school. And I think where we're seeing maybe more challenge is at the high school, which is why I put forth that question to Madonna on whether she's seeing that more at high schools anecdotally than perhaps at other schools versus other years. And her sense is, yeah.
Yeah, and my sense is that is from what I'm seeing is that it's not COVID related. I think it's just the fact that they can be absent now and it's not counted against them. And with some of these schools, it's schools where typically, the students may not come in on time first period. So now even the amount of students that are late, like that number has increased significantly in the schools that I've been in as well. Or, just them having a lot of more students having sporadic attendance is more common this year.
Yeah, I think, on a given day, if a student and an adolescent or older adolescent doesn't feel well, it's just different than it was 2 years ago. Perhaps because of what you've said, Madonna, like the ability to kind of like maneuver around not being present and still kind of complete assignments and learn has changed a little bit in favor of that being able to happen remotely in some ways, even through just tech. And then there's just like, we're just carrying stuff, I think. It's just easier to like, I've been home for the past year and a half. I don't feel like coming in today. I'm going to give in and not come in today. And so I think that's probably true across everyone to some extent. And so I think that still exists. I was listening to something on the radio last week, and the superintendent of the year, who I think is in Missouri, was being interviewed. And he said that, March of 2020 it was a different kind of like challenge. Like, how do we get technology out? How do we take attendance? How do we kind of engage with kids? It was like, you just kind of figured it out, and there was no playbook for it. And so there was like we had the ability to kind of just figure it out without like worrying about messing up. Yeah. And now we're kind of back. And in March 2022, like we're still carrying stuff. And so it's going to take a while to kind of just get out of this and get to a place that like is mentally similar to where we were in 2019. And so his comment was like, this is just going to take a long time. In some ways, March of 22 is as challenging and more challenging in trying to like solve problems than it was in March 2020.
And I'm looking today at today's attendance in District 16 schools, which is approximate to where most of our students reside, are around 85. Williamsburg Preparatory, which is a school, 2 blocks away, is at 87 today. I'm seeing 78 at the next closest high school, Abbott Tech, or A-Tech rather. So I think it's fairly consistent for high schools. And even looking at the numbers in District 16 and District 14 today, there is a big spread between an elementary school and a high school. So that does explain the difference between our two schools, I think.
So we're tracking this information. I do feel like staffing wise, we're probably more generous in being able to intervene for kids who are particularly chronically absent. So that feels good. And yet it's not something we're able to just sort of like quickly resolve. So I think we'll continue to use our resources, think about ways in which we use them more in a smarter way, and then also look ahead to 22, 23. I think with that, just going down to table 5B, the one thing you'll notice, the one thing I'll point out here is that there's been a slight, modest sort of decrease in the number of students who are chronically absent or have attendance below 80%. So we're making slight ground in that area, and that's what we want to be doing, but it's a grind to have that happen. Because there might be an individual case that may take several days and several hours on the phone in communication with teammates to then kind of figure out, resolve, build out a plan, talk to parents, motivate, and then have kids in school more often than they were in the prior week. So it's a lot of work. So I'll move us forward. That's attendance though. So good to kind of just like talk through that. That was helpful. I'm going to move forward now to suspension. Last month I had mentioned there was an altercation in our high school that was offsite in a subway that was fairly serious, involved about 6 of our students. And I had said at the time that, you know, we're doing all the right things and communicating with families, getting them together, talking about kind of just like the seriousness of the event, what to do moving forward, safety is an issue, et cetera. I think those meetings have gone fairly well overall. We have had students back in the building now under different support plans, and we had 2 of those students that have decided to transfer and have safety concerns. This was something that had happened outside the building. And so, you know, we feel good about everything that we can do inside the building and even have some control over what goes on outside school just through relationships, community, et cetera. And at the same time, not full control. Unfortunate, but I do feel good about the way in which our high school team negotiated this such that families felt supported through all this. No one wants to go through their kids being in fights with others. So that's where we are from a stats standpoint. I think we're kind of on target to be below where we want to be with suspensions based on prior data right now. And so we're about 75% complete this year. And right now we've had 8% of our students uniquely suspended. We don't want to go beyond that much more. And so we continue to teach them that as proactively as much as we can. And then on the reactive side, help students sort of learn from and resolve issues when they come up. I will say this, I would say, I'd have to look at this, but I'm fairly confident that more than half of the suspensions this year and perhaps in recent years have been due to out of school incidents as opposed to in-school things. And so I think we need to take responsibility for some of that when things happen outside the building. We can't turn our heads because it often then comes into our building and impacts kids' abilities to engage in their learning safely and in a healthy way. And at the same time, I think as a result, when we do that, it does tend to sort of increase some of the statistics that I do believe that other schools may not kind of directly intervene in as much. So that's just some context there. Are there any questions about discipline-related matters at school, either over the past month or more generally, philosophically, about how we are approaching this? Great, I'll move things forward and I'm going to go right to student recruitment and provide an update there. I think I said our lottery for our middle school students was the first a couple of Fridays ago, and then at the high school it will be tomorrow. Let's see, with regard to numbers, I think on the positive side of things, we did have more applications in the 6th grade this year at lottery time than we had last year. So 243 applicants for 96 seats versus 228 the year before, so up 15 there. If you look at the last column, you can see by grade where we ended up with regard to the number of applications submitted by lottery time this year versus last year. And so overall, up across both sites, down a bit in the 7th grade. And so overall, I think a fairly solid showing in a competitive year. My sense of this, and I don't have evidence of this either, is that I think we're better at this than we've ever been before, and it's more competitive than before. And so with that, we've been able to perhaps avoid some of the decreases in applications through that additional work and expertise. And I think some of that shows here. I've mentioned, I think in prior meetings, that there are a couple of schools and CMOs that are closing sites around our middle school area in central Brooklyn. I think Uncommon being one, they're closing one middle school, and I believe I've heard that Success might be closing another school in Fort Greene. So it's competitive, and at the same time, I feel like we're stepping up. So, Chris, do you want to say anything more about recruitment, where things stand, or maybe some next steps going into this week and next?
Absolutely. So we had 2 big events last Thursday. Well, it was hybrid. So we had both a virtual event and an in-person dinner for everybody that was accepted to the middle school, had about 30 to 40 families at each event. So the fact that they're showing up for events after the lottery is really excited about that. And now the work is individual calls to everybody that was accepted, moving them from accepted into enrolled as we collect their documents and they officially sign on for Unity for next year.
So lots of calls being made with families to then help them through the enrollment process. Just from an information standpoint, we are benchmarking the number of enrollment forms completed. We look at birth certificates in as a proxy for like I'm in. Looking at that number on a daily and weekly basis, mainly a weekly basis versus last year. So we know the speed with which we're enrolling kids now versus where we were last year, just to keep pace and make perhaps moves to be a bit stronger each year moving forward. No there.
So I have a question for you. How do you manage the fine line of wanting to drum up enough support for students to enroll in the high school and then looking at the takeaways, noting that you have fewer seats available next year? How do you manage that?
Yeah, Chris, you want to take that one? Lenny, good to have you here. How are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you? Good evening, everyone.
So we anticipate, as in every other year, the majority of our ninth graders will join us from our middle school. We actually had a big field trip last Friday where all of our eighth graders got to visit the high school and see what it was like to visit the high school for a day, be a high schooler for a day. And everything from culinary club to step team to academic presentations. So the kids, our eighth graders really got into it. So that pulls in the majority of our eighth graders, promoting Unity High School as a great option for our eighth graders. And then the small portion of ninth grade, 10th grade seats from the outside world is really from the lottery. Thankfully, year over year, we traditionally always have a wait list for the high school. So that's where the lottery really matters for the high school. Students in District 13 get preference, siblings get preference. So we build up the excitement for our high school, both for our eighth graders and for traditionally eighth graders from other charter middle schools as well, including visiting those schools, alumni visits, open houses. So right after the lottery tomorrow, I'm going to have an open house for accepted families. So that's really how we get people excited for it.
Yeah, no, so that's helpful. Thank you. I guess let me rephrase the question differently. I recognize that you and the team do an outstanding job of promoting excitement for Unity. I guess my question is, if I'm a parent and my child applies to the school for high school, and because we have limited seats, now I get discouraged because I'm not accepted. And then now I start to go out and say, oh, don't even bother to apply, you won't get in. That's what I'm trying to figure out. How do you manage that, the latter aspect of my question?
Got it. I've been working in this, like doing student recruitment for high schools for a few years now. So I feel good about knowing how much to over accept, to the point that if you don't, those on the wait list, if they still want to get in, they'll have a spot later on. And I explain that. So there are some families that are applying from the Bronx. I'm not really interested in our school, but at this point, I feel good about being able to over accept by a certain amount, similar to how colleges do, to know that by the first day of school, we'll have a full school, but we won't be over enrolled. And we, especially at the high school level, we'll still be collecting brand new applications in May, June, July, August, September. So through that, even if a family's not accepted, I tell them, even if you're not accepted on lottery day, don't give up hope, because we have so many applications from multiple boroughs. We, especially at the high school, we do often move through quite a bit of the wait list because it's so easy to apply, which is great. But then you get applications that are folks not really interested in your school. So I tell families, even if you're not accepted on the lottery day, don't give up hope. Every year we do move through the wait list. You might get accepted in April. You might get accepted in May. You might get accepted in June. But if you want a spot at Unity, you will very likely get it. Just don't give up hope. Let's keep in touch.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yep, my pleasure.
So we'll move forward. Are there any more questions about recruitment, just given that this is a busy time of year for this and it's an important matter? Cool. So we'll have updates next month about where things are with regard to number of sixth graders who have enrolled, and the same with our ninth grade. Just very quickly, the last couple of tables here, just so that we're all on the same page with regard to updates. I'm going to move us to, I'll move us to staff recruitment. This table provides just a snapshot of where we are now with regard to the vacancies we have at the school. And so you'll see we've divided it up among middle school and high school, and then also leadership positions versus teacher positions versus other positions, which mainly are like administrative or operational in nature. So you'll see at the middle school, we've got approximately 4 openings right now, and then you'll see the openings specifically in the 4th column. And the same thing for the high school. We've got 6 openings right now that we're actively hiring for, and you'll see those listed here in the 5th column. So just from a hiring standpoint right now, I think the good news here is that we've been receiving more applications at this point of the year than perhaps ever before. I attribute that to the work that our Director of Special Projects is doing, and the work that Chris is doing up front on the screening end and getting the word out. We're using LinkedIn much more heavily this year than we have in the past, and making connections with folks who we perhaps wouldn't have in the past, and not using that resource. We have put forth a referral bonus to our staff now, who refer someone who we then hire and keep for the coming year. And so we've had a couple of those come through recently, but yeah, we've had a good batch of applications come through recently. That's kept us busy with hiring. And so at this point in time, it's still, we've hired effectively one person at this point in time, one staff member at the middle school, a learning specialist, and we've got a few offers outstanding. We'll hear by the end of this week with those, and we've got a few more that we're going to make by the end of this week. So things are moving. I do feel pretty good about this. So that's where things stand with regard to staff recruitment for the coming year. Are there any questions, insights here? But Donna, you had mentioned earlier that you were seeing some movement in staffing or some turnover at some of the schools you're working with. Any context that'd be valuable for us to consider as we move forward with our process?
Yeah, it's been there's a shortage definitely in the DOE. So teachers looking more now to work closer to home, right? Where that wasn't as much as a thing prior to the pandemic. And then also in charters, but it's more so about like what the charters are offering. So I'm in a couple of charters where the benefits package is not that ideal, or where the location is not ideal because it's not by a train station and things like that. And so teachers are just looking to be somewhere that does offer a better pension, or, better health packages, or are just closer to public transportation is what I've been seeing.
Mm-hmm. A good portion of my time and Melissa's time right now have been with just convening with our current staff and setting up agreements for the coming year. And I will say, a few months in, after we made some pretty big decisions with this board, that the change in bands salary wise it's been helpful, and that the move to increase our benefits to offer the match that we do has also been helpful. I guess the fact that we're in Bed-Stuy and Williamsburg also is in our favor. So that's all good news with regard to positioning us to be attractive to candidates who are looking around. So that's good. This is probably a top 3 item for me right now with regard to time. I'll move us forward as we close out on 3 more updates. So just with family participation, we did have spring conferences with families. We do them virtually now. One of the technological breakthroughs of COVID. We had 3/4 of our families in. Our goal was to have 70% of our families in. So we met that goal. That's strong. At the high school, we have conferences this week on Thursday, Wednesday night and Thursday. So we look forward to strong showings there too, so that those connections can happen. Families have the information they need. We're in collaboration with them in support of their kids. So that feels good. With regard to student participation in extracurriculars after school, a strong winter. We've got a whole host of students taking part in clubs at the middle school in the afternoon. More than half of our kids are registered for that. And so that's a really solid resource for families, and having kids have something fun to do after school. And so they've taken advantage of it, and we're happy to do that in partnership with the group that we do partner with. And at the high school, we had a good showing with regard to the internal clubs we're offering. And so overall, strong showing versus our goals for the year, which is to have 40% of our kids taking part in something after school on average each season. We are well above that. SPED compliance wise, I provide this update to you 3 times a year. I'm going to give you the winter update now, and I think it's also solid. So we look at the percentage of students whose IEPs are up to date, percentage of students whose IEPs are fully met and then partially met. And so you'll see a lot of green and yellow here with regard to percentages. And so we offer, at least a partial mandate or partial set of services to all of our students. And so that's why you see 100% there. With regard to fully meeting services, you'll see that we're at 82% at the high school. The big difference there is just that there are some students with 12 to 1-to-1 needs, and they've opted into our integrated co-teaching model instead. And they have the option of seeking something out at other schools, but choose to stay with us. So that's why that gap exists. And then at the high school, for IEPs being up to date, we're at 83%, but we've held 10 of 11 of the meetings where IEPs are out of date. Now it's just about the CSE formalizing and saying, all right, that meeting happened, and recognizing the change in status for IEPs being up to date. So a lot of detail there, but all of this to say that we're doing the work that we have to with regard to compliance, and doing it fairly strongly. I think that's it for this month. No change in COVID vaccination rates at this point in time. We're at 34% as a school. And so there's been very little movement, I think, is sort of like the concerns among families and among society, at least over the past couple of months, have been fairly tame. So we'll see what happens moving forward with a couple of recent changes with regard to increases, but that's where we are now. So that's a deeper dive with dashboard data this month. Before moving on, are there any general questions about perhaps tables that we didn't talk about this evening? All right, so we're going to move forward then with strategic planning. I'll bring up a couple of general kind of headlines of where we are now in terms of planning for the coming year, and then talk a bit about academically what we're aiming for in the coming year, which is no different than what we've done this past year. So as a senior leadership team, we have met on 2 or 3 occasions now to begin thinking about priorities for the coming year, and have identified approximately 4 buckets that we feel are priorities for the coming year, and sort of seeing the year through as positively as possible, given what we've experienced this year. That's related to culture at the school. It's related to instructional quality at the school. It's related to racial equity at the school, and it's related to family engagement at the school. So those are the areas we're really focusing our attention as we move into the year. In the coming month, we'll be establishing just clear visions of what success looks like under each of those bins in the year 22-23. And then from there, building out some indicators and some measures of success for each of those that can be then looked at over time to assess demonstrably whether we're making gains in these 4 areas. And then finally, later on this spring, we'll be building out, like, here are the actions we've got to take to see these through, both in the spring, in the summer, and then moving into the year. And so that's the process we've been taking the past couple of years, which I think has been strong. And so we'll continue in that work in the coming month, and I'll provide some updates to you on how that's going with greater detail then. I will say that I'm going to close my screen and open it back up, and just bring to you what we focus on annually academically per our charter. So give me a moment. And so if you recall, with SED, our authorizer, there are a number of benchmarks, and benchmark, wrong one, sorry. There we are. Here we are. So benchmark one of SED's framework relates to kind of academic achievement and performance. And so for us, we align our academic goals each year with that benchmark. And so as you see here, we've divided our goals across sites, grades 6 through 8 and 9 through 12. And so in any given year, we are looking to grow in an accelerated fashion, show proficiency versus our districts of comparison, and then demonstrate high school readiness. We have a couple of general areas in which we show that. With growth, we use STAR. With proficiency, we do use our internal assessments as well as state exams. And then with high school readiness, we generally depend on reading levels in addition to our growth and proficiency levels. In the high school, the same general areas apply. We care about growth. We care about graduation. We care about being college ready. And so for us, growth is demonstrated by all students showing growth. We've got a certain metric that we use within STAR to assess the degree to which all of our students are growing. We've looked at that over the course of the year during SLC meetings and then during these meetings. With graduation, the number that we seek to realize is 93% of our kids graduating in 4 years. We've been above that mark, just under that mark, around that mark over the past 2 years with our cohorts. Regarding college readiness, we measure that through the number of students who are taking AP courses in grades 11 and 12, and then seeking to both maintain the number of kids, where we do have a large number of kids, relatively speaking, who do take AP courses, and then looking to increase the number that earn college credit based on that end of year exam. Finally, the other college ready measure that we use is just looking at the number of high passes, so to speak, the percentage of students who pass their Regents exams with high scores as defined by what CUNY says represents college readiness. And so those are some of the ways in which we look at success over the course of each year. We'll continue to do so. So these don't change. The way in which we get there may change depending on relative strengths and weaknesses in a given year. And so some of our strategic planning is built around how we do this from one year to the next. And so we'll be sharing out some of that in the coming month as we detail that out. Are there any questions about how we're defining success in 2023 academically, or perhaps ideas from this team on how we might define it academically or otherwise as we move into a new year?
So I'm looking at, in terms of students' ability to engage in like performance tasks or problem-based learning or things like writing and math, things like that, that may not necessarily be tested on a STAR exam. Is that something that you include in your proficiency ratings, or like how do you take account of that in terms of their learning?
Melissa, how would you answer that?
We're attending to a couple of things. In proficiency, we're often looking at the ELA and math exams at middle school, at Regents and AP exams at high school, which do have, say, more writing in mathematics and STEM. Another thing I'd say at the high school is we're thinking about, some courses have these end-line assessments that are very important to kids' outcomes. Some have multiple. You take a course like AP US History, students take an AP immediately followed by a Regents. But there are other courses where we're really going to be doubling down on what those culminating tasks and performance tasks look like. And writing is sort of, I was a writing teacher. one of the initiatives that we started this year. We paused when safety became a concern, but we're hoping to continue. And I apologize for the noise in the background. It's bath night.
And we thank George for the good work he's doing this evening. Madonna, does that answer your question?
It does, yeah.
Other ideas here? I think that's a good one. Like, what are we not measuring here is kind of the question you're also getting at. And like, this is a pretty rigid, defined set of academic objectives that, again, aligns directly with our authorizer's benchmark of success, but is certainly not exhaustive. Cool. So I think that, again, this is a quick dose. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Josh, and apologize to everybody, but for being a little bit on the move here and not being quite as plugged in as normal. I guess the only thing I would push is to establish push ourselves towards a higher goal on academic growth. I feel like sometimes we're a little bit incremental on growth, and maybe push ourselves more towards getting to at least 50% type proficiency numbers. And even if we don't hit it in the first year, I think our sights should really be a little bit higher.
Yeah, no, I think we're on the same page, and I appreciate the push there with regard to what's the rate of growth that seems to be sort of reasonable yet ambitious. And so, yeah, I think we share the sort of vision for what we'd like to be with regard to the percentage of students that we have leaving our 8th grade who demonstrate grade level proficiency by high school. And so that's there. I think we get there if we just do some of the math in having a growth percentile ranking on average of 60. So that's if we maintain that growth for all of our students over the course of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, we get there, and we need to be unwavering in that goal. And so, we shared out some data earlier this year where the rate was closer to 50 and not 60, and that's going to have some consequences, and we don't want that. And so I think there are ways in which we can do that, both from an instructional leadership level, and from like a cultural level, in kind of what we're really bringing the kids in a sort of rigorous, joyful fashion. So our goals are aligned with regard to wanting to sort of see that through as quickly as possible. So I'm going to move us forward now. That was the quick hit on strategic planning, and there'll be more to talk about in the coming month as we continue to polish off some of our internal thinking about big initiatives for the coming year that gets us to some of those outcomes that Jake has underlined just now. So I think, Jim, back to you. You want to move into committee reports?
Sorry, I had to step away for a second. Who's up first? Is it ELA? AFC.
AFC.
Yeah, sorry, AFC, sorry, yeah.
And so I think Alex is on. I think just generally the past AFC meeting was one in which we talked about monthly updates. I think that was as of the end of February. And then we did some preliminary work with regard to the budget for the coming year and for the 5-year budget. So Alex, you want to kick things off with regard to the monthly update?
Sure thing. I'll just share my screen. I am going to kill my video. I'm getting a little bit of lag, so don't need to do that. All right. So as Josh mentioned, this is the financial report through the end of February. And much in our previous reporting periods, I feel like I am just repeating the same thing. I'm sorry, it's not very exciting. But as it has been, our near-term indicators and long-term indicators are all healthy, well within the recommended and required ranges. And pause this for a minute. What we do continue to see is the variance in enrollment, which we would expect. Right now, we are reporting an enrollment of 520 compared to the budget of 532. There have been some changes within the special education classifications. So the variance that's attributed specifically to enrollment has narrowed to about 230,000 as of the end of February. We have not received any additional grant monies. So everything that's reported on this page is all of the grant funds that we knew coming into this year and what we will continue to be able to utilize next year and then the following year. I don't have any specific comments on any of our balance sheet accounts. The only note is this will look a little bit different this time next year. There are some standards that are transitioning in terms of how we recognize our leases. So we'll have some additional accounts on this. We'll be getting rid of deferred rent and taking on a right to use asset and liability for any of our operating and finance leases. As far as our profit and loss, so our net income to date, and this does include all of our grant support, is a little bit more than $1.7 million. Now, what we have been doing since the beginning of the year is we're pulling out any expenses and revenue related to these grants so that we can kind of adjust to see where we would be all else equal. After those adjustments and even pulling out expenses that we know are attributable to COVID but are not necessarily covered by grants, we have an adjusted net income of about $676,000 compared to a $992 where we would have been budgeted. Of the $315,000 variance, $230,000 of that is attributable directly to our variance in enrollment. The remainder is likely COVID expenses that we have incurred, COVID testing, that are not tied to a grant directly for reimbursement. Cash continues to be healthy, in large part because of the PPP, which was a huge influx last year. But as we run this out through the remainder of this year, we are in a very healthy cash position. So that is the very brief February report. Did anybody have any questions?
And Jim and Marianne, would you add anything to that report out?
No, I think it's a pretty quiet period.
Yeah, nothing on my end other than we'll get to work on that. I got the model for the 5-year. We'll get to work on that.
Yeah. And I think with that, so we also discussed the sort of 1.0 version of the budget for the coming year, and then that also corresponding with a 5-year budget. We'll have to, each year in June, the board does approve a budget for the coming year. And then I think with our renewal application up in August, we also will provide to them our budget for the next 5 years. So we're working on that now. We shared with the AFC, it's Alex, myself, and Chris, a draft of where we are now with it and talk through some of the assumptions that we're making that I think drives the budget. We're trying to be conservative and yet realistic. And so we talked about our enrollment assumptions in the coming year. And Marianne had some good feedback with regard to the way in which we might want to just set things right and conservatively such that we're not in a place where we're under enrolled versus our budget as we are this year. And so we're kind of taking that back to shop and thinking about what's best there. So our enrollment assumptions are key. With regard to per pupil funding increases, we've got a pretty good sense of that, and it's fairly generous this year. Per pupil funding should increase by 4.7%. We've made some assumptions around inflation, which we're going to revisit. It may be a little low in comparison to what is actually the case. So we're going to revisit that. We talked a bit about kind of compensation, where things are now, and I feel good about where we are as a percentage of revenues. So we'll continue to sort of finalize that through conversations being had with existing staff members and with people who we bring on. And then we're making some assumptions with regard to contributions and donations that are fairly in line with what we've done in the past. And so those are some of the big movers. There is federal funding that we're eligible for in the coming year as well. And so we're building that into our model and careful about how we're using that and making sure that's represented on both sides of the budget. And so the conversation on Friday was mainly about some of those elements and the trade-offs and what some of the right thinking was. So while we're not going to bring the budget to this board this evening, we may do so in May to get some feedback from team. And then obviously again in June, we'll bring things up for approval. So Jim, Alex, or Marianne, would you add anything to that summary?
No, I mean, I think I just said that we also talked, sorry, talked about, potential inflation related changes, but you thought the sort of non-staffing envelope was manageable, by reducing the amount of stuff we purchase if we need to. And, you know, obviously we'll see how things go. We flagged a couple items that might land a little more expensive than we've been expecting. I mean, I know the medical benefit is under renewal and we don't know where that's going to go. I think the insurance quotes are probably going to land a little higher than probably what we think, but we, you know, again, we'll have a better sense of that probably by the time we need to finalize the budget.
Great. So I think that's the report out for the AFC.
Okay, great. DSC?
Yeah, so we did meet formally on a call this past month. It's been fairly quiet, but I think the moves are, maybe the updates would be portable classrooms are in, we're using them. It's been great, so that's helpful. And we should re-engage with our landlord in the coming month to talk about both the coming year and what's possible with regard to expansion related matters and the feasibility of that. So that's in the coming month. I don't know if Sal or Jim or Jake would add anything there. Cool. So I think we can keep things going, Jim.
Yeah, UCBC.
Yeah. So we didn't meet there either. Things are quiet. Nothing to bring to the full board. There are a couple of initiatives kind of in the works. One involving a trip in the coming year where kids in the 10th grade will have an opportunity to travel abroad. So that's something new partnership wise. So we may have something more concrete to report out next month. And then with SLC, I'm going to have Melissa kind of share out. She and Jeanette were a part of that call last Wednesday. And Melissa, with that, do you want me to show both the school leader report or the SLC slides?
I think the school leader report is probably enough. Jeanette had some sage advice about not necessarily going line by line. Folks can look at that. And we've been tracking this information all year. So we did our last official set of mock examinations at the high school. And when I say mock examinations, I mean that the tests were exactly similar in regards to timing, length, and testing conditions to our high stakes tests, our Regents and our AP exams. And the majority of exams were previously administered Regents or AP exams. We made some slight adjustments to content in the cases where a student would never have seen the content before and it would have been too frustrating to continue. So an example, because I was history chair, might be we would not have a student write an essay on the Cold War if they were still learning about World War II. So we would replace an essay from the Regents in those cases. And we did that a limited amount in history and mathematics, where the content was really is really important. So do know when you look at these scores that kids were tested on test items that they have not yet learned. And you're looking at a chart here with some comparisons. The comparisons are to the real tests taken in June of 2019, the last time these tests were administered. So overall, if students were to sit for the exams at the end of March, just as the exams exist, in using the scales from the past, 1 of 8 Regents classes would currently be meeting end of year Regents goals. We are currently exceeding our end of year 2019 performance on 3 of the 8 exams. So we are seeing some growth in some subject areas, with geometry being kind of the most striking there. Josh, do you have the next chart for students with disabilities?
I don't, no.
I can also just say that, like, students with disabilities, we're tracking the same information. 2 of those 8 courses are currently already exceeding end of course goals, and 4 out of 8 courses are currently already exceeding our performance in 2019 for students with disabilities. We're also looking at our AP courses. Those are coming up quite a bit sooner. Our first one is on May 2nd. And when we look at AP courses, given the goals we've set, 6 out of 9 courses are currently on track to meet our core goals there, with students receiving a 3 or higher. You can see that comparison to our 2021 results. I'll pause for any questions on how we're doing. Cool. Josh, you can scroll to some of the conclusions for folks who are visuals. So we're seeing some strengths across the board. All of our ELA courses are on track to meet goals. We think that this is because we have a strong, experienced team. Everyone administering an AP or Readiness exam in our school has been teaching that course for multiple years at our school, and some for multiple years outside of our school. We also saw in geometry, 57% of students are projected to earn credit. Only 11% of our students earned a passing score in 2019 when students sat for the exam. Again, that teacher has been in that content for multiple years and now is doing some good work with a coach who has been in that role for multiple years. This is a theme we're seeing. And the majority of our AP courses would have students meeting their goals if they sat for them today. And again, promise in those courses where folks have taught for multiple years. Our AP goals were set using our past couple years of performance as well. So they seem like they're reasonable goals for this year. Any questions on the strengths? Challenges we're seeing, we are currently underperforming in earth science, living environment, and possibly in US history. That data is always a little murky. US history regents, that data is always a little bit murky because a large portion of the students are taking AP mocks. Those tests are similar in structure, with the AP being more challenging. So we're preparing students for the more challenging exam and then doing several weeks of preparation for the regents following that exam really prepares them. But it's difficult to forecast for the entire group. Students with disabilities are currently underperforming our goals in living environments, Algebra 1, Earth Science, and Algebra 2. Any questions on the challenges?
No, just to add some context, I would only say that, I mean, we've talked about staffing, we've talked about conversations, we've talked about kind of keeping key people. And so I think with some of the challenges we're facing, there's definitely a correlation between perhaps inexperience, someone coming in new, perhaps a late departure in August, then trying to backfill that, and then having multiple people teach a course, to having them perhaps a coach out for a while for personal reasons. So these things do add up, and I think they do often kind of result in performance that is subpar in comparison to what we think we could be or wouldn't like to be.
Yeah. While Earth Science was not performing at our goal several years ago, we were exceeding that in living environment. And this year, science in particular was hit very hard between that summer departure. That was in science, a brand new teacher, and a coach who is not available. And our newer principal supporting that subject area. So that's been a really challenging year. However, like, here are some of the next steps. Our science coach is back and is devoting the majority of her time to our regions facing classes. In addition, we did an action planning day. Folks were able to plan for the rest of the year, including creating tutoring lessons and groups and after school groups for students. We kicked that off this week. Our principal is taking on groups in Algebra 1 and in science, Algebra 1 being a really key course. And our instructional leadership team will be supporting students very directly in preparing for these exams. And we are looking for opportunities where maybe we need to reassess after kids have learned a little bit more or have gotten some coaching based on exam performance.
So the runway is one in which we have AP exams in early May and in mid-May, and then in early June, mid-June, kids sit for Regents exams. So that's the path. Any insights or questions based on what's been provided on how things are going high school-wise, academically, based on mock exams?
Yeah, can you scroll back to the first chart? It's shocking the disparity in performance. I think geometry was, yeah. So, I mean, how would you guys look at this in terms of how much relates to the teacher? Well, I mean, what do you guys ascribe this huge disparity, earth science versus geometry, to pick one?
Yeah. So if you look, geometry several years ago didn't look that dissimilar from earth science. The teacher who is currently in geometry is in his 4th year teaching the subject at Unity now. And our math chair is in her 2nd year, and they spend a lot of time together. There's also a really strong co-teaching pairing. Every single geometry course we have is co-taught, 2 teachers in the room giving tons of feedback to kids. Oddly, the same co-teacher is in earth science, not her like subject area. She came into Unity with strong knowledge of, but here we see a teacher who's iterating year over year and getting stronger and getting that coaching. Earth science is a brand new teacher. He's fresh out of school. He has never taught before. He inherited a set of curriculum that I think was better suited to remote. His coach was on leave. He was supported by our principal, but who does not have that content area there. So, so that's number one. Number two, I think that the exam students took was printed from the internet. Not printed from the internet, that's not very generous. It was in old Regents, and students haven't learned 100% of the content. I don't think that that's going to make up the difference between our goal and what we're seeing. It was probably about 15% of that content. But there are more tested items on there that students have not yet learned or experienced ever, because it is that Regents is very memorization based. So those, I think, are some of the reasons there. And which is why we're putting a lot of our coaching energy towards that earth science course, and really that living environment course, because that is one where students have experienced the most success classically, and they need one science. We'd like to set up our freshmen.
So do the teachers see this data and understand where,
yeah,
you know?
I shared this exact slide with my entire team. Or I shared, I think, the chart version with my entire team on Friday.
Is there an opportunity, professional development opportunity here, where you get somebody from the outside to come in and, and just go at it and help some of these newer folks?
Firstly, like, we're going to have somebody inside come and support them. That's where we're seeing the most success. That, I think, is some of the Mr. Welch in geometry has gotten a lot of attention from his coach, from me, from our current principal over the last couple of years. And then two, yes, I think there are some New Visions is a strong example of good curriculum that we draw from, that's Regents based, and they do development. We can send folks there, or a science consultant with New York State knowledge. And I think better designed assessment that is like, if we taught it, do kids learn it? So I will also say that this teacher will not be returning next year. So we have a couple folks with more experience here, and we'll see what that need is specifically. But having this individual train up is not going to bear fruit long term.
How much of the discrepancy is attributable, in your view, to the teacher versus maybe the test was created improperly or whatever? How much?
80%.
Oh, okay.
And as you can see, like, we were below goal as well. But I think that this is a very green teacher. I do think maybe splitting the difference between that 50 and that 6, but we still would be quite a distance away.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I don't know much about the teachers, but if this helps a little bit for context, the geometry exam is definitely typically more difficult for students to pass than living environment. So with these numbers here, I would definitely assume that most of it is probably attributed to the teacher, the numbers that you're seeing here.
And I would also say earth science does tend to be a slightly more challenging to pass than a living environment in Algebra 1.
Yeah, sorry, earth science. I meant to say not living environment. Yeah.
Still, I think geometry tends to be about a 60 across districts. Earth science tends to be about a 70 across districts. So.
I think.
Well, it's obviously disappointing. It's question, you know, I don't know if you guys saw it, but there was this McKinsey report that came out talking about how the lockdowns affected, you know, student performance broadly, and the setbacks and learning are essentially, I think it was like 6 months across the board, with some a year and some 3 months. So you would expect some of that. That doesn't mean you capitulate and accept that. So there's a fight to be fought here, right? So, so you would expect the numbers to be down a bit. It's just, okay, the numbers are down. Now, what do you do? It sounds like it's 80% is at the actual educator, you know, level.
And I'd say strategically, I don't weight all these exams the same. Strategically, some of these are more important to student outcomes, tend to be the exams that are that students use for credit going forward, maybe to test out of subject areas in college, or that they tend to be their Regents credit. That's their foundation. So ELA, Global 2, Algebra 1, and Living Environment are really those bread and butter courses. So thinking about that, I'm not going to throw out Earth Science, but I'm like, also, though it seems a lot more promising in Living Environment, I really need that to inch up too. So there's some ways that we're thinking about that. I'll also say that I've been in regular contact with a friend who's a principal at another small charter in Brooklyn, and she's alarmed by the Regents results that they're forecasting this year, and their school has not had to confront that in the same way in the past. So I think that we are seeing this a lot.
To your point though, Jim, so where can we control things? You know, that's an important question to pose out, and where can we kind of learn some things and get better at what we do, because we certainly influence what goes on in this table. I think with geometry, the story could be a multi-year story too, where a couple of years ago, there were some concerns about kind of where we were, and we doubled down. And I think there's been more attention over the past year and a half. And so I think we're seeing perhaps some fruit from that effort in prior years moving into this year. And so I think, you know, even some of the thinking we're doing now with our science might translate in the same sort of way if we're doing that work well. In being self-critical here, I would want to go back and look at, you know, we had all of these courses take interim assessments in the fall. And so if we're really at our best as a leadership team instructionally, we see what's going on in the fall, we note where there are some concerns, and then we double down on the moments. We just get better and faster at sort of these interventions at play. And so I think there were some real constraints with regard to supportive science in the fall moving into winter that were staffing related this year that have consequences. So I go back to like staffing is a big deal. And I don't mean just teachers, I mean leaders too. So I don't know if there's a lot we could have done there, but I think if we're at our best and staffing isn't as much of a constraint, that's the work that we want to be doing. So over the course of 6 weeks, we're making fairly aggressive movements of intervention when we see concerns, not 6 months.
And I'm sure there's no easy answer to it, but it seems like the learning coming out of this year should be, if we have another situation where there's a department like science with these challenges, how do you better address them going forward?
Yeah.
So
I think the answer there, yeah, and Jeanette, I appreciate we've kind of talked about this sort of issue before. I think it's got to be one there. In my mind, the approach is twofold. It's continue to expand your pipeline, so you've got people who are there and waiting internally. And then the second would be, if there's no pipeline, let's be aggressive in trying to find someone outside who can fill the gap in the near term. And so yeah, that's where I think we get better at our jobs too. So yeah. Other questions about this data for tonight or approach? Cool. So as you all know, these exams represent then kids at the end of the year having to pass them toward graduation. And so as Melissa alluded to with science, they're really, I think there are 5 exams kids have to pass. And it can be some combination of some where there are requirements. You must pass at least one science exam. And so generally speaking, more of our kids historically pass living environment and then are not required to then pass certain science, although we would want to have them experience that too. But in thinking about the graduation bar and beyond, there are some exams that we focus on very deeply because it's the cleanest path toward students being well positioned to earn a diploma and of course go beyond that.
This particular cohort in this particular year carries their living environment credit into that earth science course. So we won't see students at risk of not graduating due to this this one exam.
Folks understand that? So because we have 10th graders taking earth science right now, because of the exemption last year where they didn't have regents, kids receive the living environment regents credit. Therefore, they've got one science credit under their belt. There then isn't the same sort of pressure graduation wise to see them sort of pass the earth science exam. Obviously, we want kids to sort of understand content and learn from a course, but from a graduation level, the stakes aren't quite as high. Cool. I think anything else from SLC in that meeting on Wednesday worth bringing to the full board?
I don't know if Jeanette has anything, but these were the key points we had to share.
Yeah, I think you otherwise hit on them already, Josh.
Cool. All right, so Jim, back to you.
Associate board.
No one here tonight. So
Okay, let's move quickly through the items for approval. The minutes from the prior meeting. Presumably everybody's seen them. Any comments, questions? Okay, all in favor of approving? Show your hands. Thank you. Next item is the 2020, the 990, which I believe S&C has done a full review of. Marian, maybe you or Jeanette, one of you can comment on that.
Well, yeah, some of our colleagues have looked at it who deal with not-for-profits and have more experience reviewing those than we do. I think they had a couple questions that they were able to run down. So,
thank you. Okay, all in favor of approving filing the 990? Show of hands. Thank you. And public comment. I don't see anybody from the public here. Josh, anything you want to say about the next meeting?
Yeah, I think it'll be a full agenda. We'll take a look at the 2022-23 calendar in draft form. That'll be up for approval. We'll get a budget draft. It won't be up for approval, but we will dive into it. I'll have some updates on hiring and staffing. I'll have updates on goals for 22-23. We'll talk a bit about maybe, I hope, some additional insights on expansion and renewal. And then looking at the governance calendar that we have, we'll review conflict of interest and then also review benefits, assuming they're ready to sort of share.
Great.
Full meeting.